because I think they actually believe in this utopian dream. But that's another show, I guess. The IRS scandal. The liberals love to say that any comparison to Nixon is absolutely ridiculous. The IRS is not under the control of the president. And if I knew my history, I would know that. Well, history lesson to you, Aaron. Nixon, the second article of impeachment, had to do with Nixon's use of the IRS. And even though the president cannot fire executives within the IRS, he does have the power to appoint 3 individuals. The Treasury oversight he certainly can influence. And if you honestly believe that people such as his chief of staff were aware of this in June of 2011 and he didn't know about it, well, not a shock. There are some people out there that are so intellectually dishonest, so blind, or clinging to one issue, such as gay rights, that they will not see the bigger picture. The bigger picture is this, people. Both parties are screwing us. Both parties. I call myself a conservative, not a Republican. I view my views, I think, are more conservative, libertarian. I don't give a damn if you're gay. That's your business. I don't want to discriminate against you. But that doesn't mean that we should discriminate against other people that are Christians or people who are pro-life. In some ways, I'm sure that you're sitting back, if you're on the left, and saying, good, the Tea Party got what they deserved. At least a small group, or a group of you are. Yet, you're such hypocrites because you're supposed to be all about equal and fair treatment. Unless it's your enemy. In the words of Barack Obama himself, he specifically talked about enemies. Getting your enemy. The same man who stood up during the campaign talking about how he would be the president for all Americans. Back to Benghazi. I thought Marco Rubio had an interesting take on all the scandals. The IRS is the primary one addressed here, I guess. But let's take a listen to this clip. It's a little lengthy, but we'll take a listen to it for a while at least, and then if it gets tiring, I'll just interrupt it.
Thank you, Madam President. And I wanted to come to the floor here today to address the news of the last 4 days, which I think have shocked the American people. In a series of revelations made across news agencies about the role our federal government has played in the way it's used its power to intimidate those who they believe are not doing what they want them to do. So, for example, we learned last week in testimony in the House of Representatives that there were employees of the State Department who disagreed with the direction that the way the government was handling the Benghazi situation and the word that was being put out by the State Department. They disagreed with it. They didn't like it, and they testified last week that they were made to feel threatened. That the message was sent to them very clearly from the highest levels of the State Department that they should not be talking or saying the things that they were saying. That concerned a lot of people. Unfortunately, on Friday of last week, and what I think was an attempt to bury a story, which there's no way they were going to bury this one, and so they put it out on Friday, which is notoriously known as the slowest news day of the week because it goes into the weekend and people forget it and they move on. But this one was not easy to forget. On Friday, we learned that the Internal Revenue Service had specifically targeted organizations in this country because of their political leanings and affiliation. Now, understand, this is not something new. People have been complaining about this for a couple of years. Anecdotally, from organizations across the country coming to us and saying, we got this weird request from the IRS asking us for all sorts of things. You start to hear that everywhere. And, we still, I think, to some level have confidence and hope, have the best hopes for the federal government and the people that work within it. But as you start hearing that more and more, people became concerned. So members of this body wrote letters and inquired of the IRS, hey, is this going on? Are groups being targeted because they're a Tea Party or because they're a 9/12 group? Of course, the answer they gave was, no, that's just not true. That's absolutely false. Well, you know what? It wasn't false. Then the IRS said, but it was just this group of employees in Cincinnati. As it turns out, that's not true either. It was widespread. It was an effort throughout the IRS to specifically target groups because they were called Tea Party or Liberty groups or groups that were organized to defend the scope of government, groups that were critical of decisions being made by the government. This is chilling. This was discovered last Friday, and it's only gotten worse. Every day that goes on, we get more and more information in that regard. And then the revelation on Monday that the Justice Department of the United States, think about that, the chief law enforcement agency of the country, had issued this blanket search of the phone records of the nation's largest reporting group, the Associated Press. Now understand, if they were going after a leak that endangered America and security, that's one thing. We can have a debate about that. But they went much further than that. It was a blanket request of all these phone calls, including the switchboard. Pretty outrageous. So in the span of 4 days, 3 major revelations about the use of government power to intimidate those who are doing things that the government doesn't like. These are the tactics of the third world. These are the tactics of places that don't have the freedoms and the independence that we have here in this country. And it is shocking to Americans that this would come to light in the way that it has. I would submit to you, however, that none of this is new. That what we see emerging here is a pattern, a culture of intimidation, of hardball politics that we saw both on the campaign trail and now through the apparatus of government. I don't have enough time in 10 or 15 minutes in morning business to cite them all, but I will cite a few that have already been discussed. Let me tell you about the case of a gentleman named Frank Vandersloot. He was a couple of things. Mr. Vandersloot was the national co-chair of Mitt Romney's presidential campaign. He was also a major donor to a super PAC that was supportive of Governor Romney's campaign. In April of 2012, President Obama's re-election campaign posted on a web a list of 8, quote, wealthy individuals with less than reputable records who were contributing to Mitt Romney. It was a series called Behind the Curtain, a brief history of Romney donors. It described Mr. Vandersloot as litigious, combative, and a bitter foe for the gay rights movement. Well, curiously enough, within a few weeks, Mr. Vandersloot was the subject of not just 1, but 2 IRS audits. One for his personal life, one for his business. Coincidence? Maybe we should find out through an investigation. Then we get word of something else. This is even more, well, just equally outrageous. And that's the case of this organization called ProPublica, which was mentioned here a moment ago in relation to another discussion that was had. Now, I want to get the facts exactly right about this, but basically, as it turns out, the IRS, someone in the IRS, released 9 pending confidential applications of conservative groups to this so-called investigative reporting agency, this so-called not-for-profit impartial. We can have that debate later, but I don't want to be guilty of doing to the donors to that group of what the Obama campaign did to the donors of Mr. Romney. But let me just say that in response, they sent out information that was confidential, that was not public, illegally. They leaked from the IRS information on 9 of these groups that was then reported on by this organization, which admitted that it came from the IRS. Coincidence? It doesn't end there, by the way. This is not just limited to the IRS. This is a culture of intimidation, a willingness to play hardball politics against your political opponents. Let's not forget the case in South Carolina of Boeing, who decided to relocate, as any business has a right to do. In the United States of America, a business should have the right to locate its operations in any state it wants. Well, when Boeing decided to relocate from Washington State to South Carolina, the NLRB came after them in a complaint, which they claimed was on the merits, but it was very straightforward. They were going after them because the union in Washington State was upset about the move. And in fact, the case was dropped partially because of political pressure. But interestingly enough, the effort was only abandoned after they negotiated a contract deal with the union. Now, listen, I can be up here all day, and I intend to keep coming back to the floor and citing examples of this. But the point is, we have going on now is a culture of hardball politics and intimidation, which is unacceptable and should be chilling to every member of this body, Republican and Democrat. This is unacceptable behavior. But this is what you get when an administration is all about politics. This administration is a 365-day-a-year, year-round political campaign. Every issue is a political campaign. Leading up to the election, and even now, every issue is a wedge. Few times in the history of this country has anyone used this office to drive more wedges among the American people than this president and this administration. And so, yes, this is the culture that's been created. They're bad and we're good. Our enemies are bad people. The people who disagree with us on policy are bad people. You don't support us on guns, you don't care about children and families. You don't support some measure against religious liberty, you're waging a war on women. On issue after issue, a deliberate attempt to divide the American people against each other for the purposes of winning an election. That is the culture that's been created. And that culture leads to this kind of behavior. Whether it was directed or not, we don't know that. I'm not saying someone picked up the phone in the White House and said, do these audits, leak this information. I am saying that when you create a culture where what's rewarded is political advantage, when you create a culture in your administration where everything is politics 24 hours, 7 days a week, when you create a culture where every issue that comes before the Congress is used to divide people against each other, to see who can get to 51% in the next election, when you create a culture like that, it leads to this kind of behavior throughout your administration. And in the days to come, we're going to be hearing more about this. We have a nominee right now to the Labor Department who has an admirable personal story, which I admire and applaud, but who has a history of using the government and his position in government to intimidate people, to do what he wants them to do. I would submit to you that Mr. Perez's nomination is bad for the country in any time. But in this administration, in this political culture, after what we have learned in the last few days, even more so. And I hate to single him out, but that's one of the pending ones that are before us. And the point is, my friends, this is what we are dealing with. And a cautionary tale about expanding the scope and power of government. Because this same IRS that was willing to do this same IRS that was willing to target groups because of their political leanings, this same IRS that audited Mr. Vandersloot after he happened to appear on the Obama enemy list, this same IRS will now have unfettered power to come after every American and ensure that if either you're buying insurance or you're paying them a tax. Every American business. The front lines of enforcing Obamacare falls to the IRS. That is what happens when you expand the scope and power of government. It's always sold as a noble concept. It's always offered up as government. We're going to give the government more power so they can do good things for us. But the history of mankind proves that every time a government gets too much power, it almost always ends up using it in destructive ways against the personal liberties of individuals. And that's why the framers of our Constitution were so wise to impose real constitutional limits on the power of our government, because they knew from history that this was the case. That's why our Constitution says that unless government at the federal level is specifically given a power, it doesn't have it. That's why it says that. That's why you see people stand up here on the floor and fight to protect the Constitution. That's why these groups were formed around the country. Everyday Americans from all walks of life, people, some of whom had never been involved in politics before, who joined a Tea Party movement or a 9/12 movement because they feared the direction our country was going. And so they stood up and said, this is wrong. This is why. This is why this adherence to the Constitution. Because the Constitution was based on the simple truth that if government has too much power, it almost always ends up destructive. Our framers knew better than to rely on good people being in government to take care of us. They understood that government's power, in order for us to have freedom and prosperity, necessarily had to be limited Not because we're anti-government. Of course we need a government. Who provides for our national defense? Who's supposed to secure our borders? We're having this immigration debate. These are important things that our government needs to do. But if you